My name is Asa Simon Mittman, and I will just be serving as the moderator for this. So I'll introduce each speaker. They'll each speak in turn. We'll have Q&A at the end. Our second speaker, Rosemarie Garland Thomson, is not invisible. She is merely slightly delayed, and we will assume she will make it here before her time to speak. So, Michael Chemers is professor of dramatic literature in the Department of Performance, Play, and Design and Theater Arts here at UC Santa Cruz, but he is also the holder of a job that I literally dreamt of when I was but a wee young scholar and when I was a grad student. And at one point, I was at a job interview, UCLA, that went terribly. And the reason it went terribly is because they said, "Where do you see yourself in 20 years?" And I said, "I would like to be the director of the world's first Center for Monster Studies." And they thought this was an absurdity, and they did not let me forget it for the rest of my time there. What Michael has accomplished here, along with Renee and the other wonderful staff of the place, is something that was a pipe dream and a fantasy 25 years ago, and they have built this extraordinary thing. I would also say I'm deeply jealous. With great appreciation, I give to you Michael, who will start us off today with what normal is what everyone else is, and you are not. Hegemony and the American Freak Show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Asa. It's such a pleasure to have you here. I've been such a fan of your work for such a long time. It's so wonderful to see all of you here. I think I have some students. You guys ADC students? Awesome. I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to change the title of my paper to Disability and Monstrosity in Performance and Uncomfortable History. Rosemarie will be talking a lot about eugenics, so don't worry, we're going to get there. We're going to get there for sure. Okay, this is a quiz that I'm going to slip by. All right, so the relationship of fear to the unusual body is articulated by Robert Dawidoff, who says the unusual body challenges our uncomfortable, if usually repressed awareness that anyone can become disabled. We regard disability as a kind of memento mori, except that we take it as a reminder of a difficult and torturous life rather than the inevitability of death. Disability, basically when a person who is non-disabled and normalized in our normal ableist culture sees a person with a disability, it generates anxiety. And as we learned from William Doty, who wrote the most important book on mythography called Mythography, there's Rosemarie. Welcome, welcome. Come on up. Just come on up here, Rosemarie.
Apologies.
No problem. It's all good.
Mean for this to happen.
That's right. It's Santa Cruz. It's all good. It's all good. Mythologies, including monster frameworks, are designed to alleviate anxieties by providing a reassuring explanation for whatever it is that you are facing. Often this explanation is explicitly linked to a notion of deviance from an important social norm, which means that if the individual the individual who is looking may avoid a terrible fate if only they act or do not act in some specific way. So that's very much a large part of what the monster does in our culture. It provides anxiety relief. Unfortunately, this means somebody needs to be blamed, right? So this is a process that has a short stick, as it were. So disability scholars talk about three major ages of understanding disability in broad Western culture. The first we call the moral model. And this is to go back to the very etymology of the monster, which we do at this conference every year, and somebody has to do it. So I'm going to do it this year. Monstrum etymologically means the sign that warns, right? The monster is something that warns you about something, right? So if you go back to the earliest documents that still exist, by the way, if you want your documents to persist, you should not publish them online. You should, in fact, carve them into clay tablets, because that is how they're going to survive. This is from, what is this, 6,300 years ago, Rosemarie? The library at Ashurbanipal?
You're asking me.
Yeah, I got this from your book.
I just showed up.
So the oldest surviving human documents at the Library of Ashurbanipal describe unusual births and suggestions for decoding them to predict the will of the gods or coming events. Of course, these were usually bad, right? Because it's not useful to predict good things, nor is it popular, right? You need to predict bad things so that you can avoid them theoretically, right? So they are warnings, right? So literally, Terata in Greek is the same. But the most important thing is that these warnings are strongly connected to the spiritual world, which had positive effects on real people. As we went to, if you were lucky enough to see David Livingston Smith last night, he was talking about how a monster needs to be, a monster needs to be both a physical threat and a metaphysical one, right? So this is the spiritual comes in. So, but the flip side of this is that it actually provides a possibility for disability as eminence. There's evidence that people with congenital disabilities in the Stone Age became shamans, right? If they survived. Plus, the Egyptian god Bes is a little person. Saint John Colibus was a dwarf. Blessed Margaret of Castello had a funny smell, I believe. Is that right? I can't remember. And then Saint Hildegard of Bingen had terrible migraines in which she communicated with God through her migraines. This brings us to Tiny Tim, who is like the most hated emblem in disability studies that you could possibly imagine. And the reason why is because he goes to church with his father on Christmas, and his father says of him that he said that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. So this is the function of disability now, is to act as a moral warning for others, right, for non-disabled people, right? That is the function of disability in this model, right? Now, of course, I have since learned that Tiny Tim probably had rickets because he was the youngest member of the family, and they got fed last. So, but Christmas Carol is by far the single most adapted to theater story of all time, and it's a ghost story. It's important to remember that. That's a monster tale. So this breeds this whole panoply of people with disabilities being regarded as monsters, right, very specifically. So you can see I got Captain Hook up there, Darth Vader, Richard III. This is the Dr. Poison from Wonder Woman, you know. These are all people with disabilities who are also evil, right? And their disability is meant to be a sign of their evil. So they're monsters. Okay, moving on, we get to what I call the prodigal model, which is not one of the three main models. It's something that I've been sort of sticking in there, based on Rosemarie's work largely, which has freaks as revolutionaries. So this is a poster from Barnum and Bailey, The Greatest Show on Earth. You will notice, if you look in this very carefully, that the word freak does not appear anywhere on this poster, okay? It says peerless prodigies of physical phenomena and great presentation of marvelous living human curiosities. And the reason why is because folks like Charles Tripp, who was the armless calligrapher, and Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy, very famous, and this one in particular, Annie Jones. Annie Jones was a bearded lady who organized what we call the Revolt of the Freaks. And basically what happened is that all these sideshow performers decided that they didn't want to be called freaks anymore. And it had everything to do with Darwin coming and saying, which I'll get to in a minute. They didn't want to be called freaks anymore. They wanted to be called something else. And this was this huge scandal, which raved across England, because that's where the company was at the time. And Barnum and Bailey asked for suggestions for what they might be called. And Basil Wilberforce, who was a reverend, a pastor, wrote in and said, how about prodigies? And the freaks all agreed that they wanted to be called prodigies, so that's what they were called from then on. Now, this would be a startling moment of actors unionizing before Actors' Equity, except for the fact that I am absolutely convinced that it was all completely a hoax, because they did it again the next year in New York and came up with exactly the same answer. But that's Barnum for you. Okay, so this all has to do with Darwin and Darwin's idea, which was coming out at the same time, obviously, right? That we are evolving, right? That our bodies are changing. They are not stable. They are not static. This notion of the universe as a stable hierarchy is being shattered, right? Now, in England, you probably know that, that this got a lot of pushback from religious folks, right? But in America, it was actually different. Jane R. Goodall, not that Jane Goodall, a different Jane Goodall, writes that rather than evidence of shock, what emerges in American culture is a picture of eager, even over-eager receptiveness to new ideas and an alertness to changing conditions of speculations. So what happened is that the ideas of Darwin sort of became fused with Christian ideologies. The universe evolves because God wants it to evolve, right? People evolve because God wants it to evolve. So this notion then that the freaks had put forth, the prodigies had put forth, was that they were not less than, but in fact may represent a new level of human evolution. And how do you know the difference? You don't. You can't tell, right? So this worked for some freaks, not for everybody. I'm going to skip that, and I want to jump ahead. Okay, so then Rosemarie Garland Thomson, in her 1997 book, Extraordinary Bodies, talks about the medical model. And the reason I quote Rosemarie Garland Thomson is because you guys in ADC have to read this later. Disability, when it becomes medicalized, right, when it becomes a problem of a disease, posits disability as a problem to be solved, a disease to be cured, right? Now, when I first got involved in disability studies, I was like, well, duh. But what I didn't realize was what this attitude does to people who have disabilities, what it does to the value, the perceived value of the life of somebody with a disability, right? How does it affect their representation in culture? Well, really negatively, obviously, right? How does it affect their inclusion in society? Obviously, really negatively, right? So, moving on. This brings me to, and I think I'm okay on time. Okay, so this brings me to 1984, and I'm sorry I'm sort of blazing through this because I think I have more than 20 minutes of material, so I want to make sure I get through this. So in 1984, something absolutely fascinating happened, which I studied in my dissertation, which became a book, and I call it the War of Words. And in order for you to understand the War of Words, you need to understand the new model, the most recent emergent model of understanding disability, you know what I'm talking about, the social model of understanding disability, which recognizes that the problem of disability may be more with the social matrix and how disability is understood in society than it is with the person who has a disability, right? That is to say, if there's a curb cut, that benefits everybody, right? And a person in a wheelchair is not disabled while they're trying to cross the road, right? If shelves are only this high, then a person in a wheelchair is not necessarily disabled, right? If everybody can speak sign language, then deaf people are not disabled, right? Disability becomes a social construct in this framework, very similarly to race and gender, right? It operates in a very similar way, which we're more familiar with, I think, in our theory. So we have this thing that we call impairment. That's a terrible word in and of itself. There's no good language to talk about this stuff, right? Impairment suggests that there's something about you that interferes with living a quote-unquote normal life, the word normal, of course, being extremely problematic. That is a thing that maybe can be measured scientifically, maybe not. It has a relationship to disability, but it's not disability. Disability is in the social matrix. It's how it's understood, how the concept is understood. Skin color is something that may be measured or compared to in some kind of social biological way. Race is a fiction. Race is a social construct. It's ridiculous. As we know, there's more genetic variation within racial groups than between them, right? So race is a fiction. Skin color is a thing that might be somehow real and measurable. Biological sex is a thing that may be somehow scientifically measurable. I don't know. It has a relationship to gender, but it's not gender, obviously, right? Gender is much more fluid and capacious than biological sex, right? So impairment is in relationship to disability in the same way. There is a thing, but it has very little to do with how the disabled person operates through culture, right? Okay, so it is, in other words, political, changeable, perverse, counterfactual, harmful, and of course propagated through culture. Perfect timing. Okay, so this brings me to Otis Jordan. When he was first performing at the Incredible Wonders of the World sideshow, he was called Frog Boy, okay? He is, as you can see, a handsome African-American gentleman. His act was that he performed amazing cigarette tricks and witty banter with the audience. So he could fold and fill and fold and light a cigarette using only his lips. And while he was doing that, he was exchanging witty improvisational banter with the audience, right? It was a great, great act. So in 1984, I brought this up, the prestigious disability researcher and activist Barbara Baskin attempted to get this International World of Wonder sideshow banned permanently from the state fair. Now, obviously, she had the best of intentions for doing this, right? This is, let's stop exploiting people with disabilities in the freak show. I mean, come on, right? But Jordan was interviewed about this controversy by Robert Bogdan, and he said, I can't understand it. How can she say I'm being taken advantage of? Hell, what does she want from me, to be on welfare? The sideshow went bankrupt and disbanded as a result of this, because it was never a very robustly financially secure organization. Jordan spent 2 years in court fighting for his right to perform. And then eventually he joined Coney Island, where this is the sideshow by the seashore. It's a completely different ball of wax than the International World of Wonder sideshow. You may recognize there Matt Frazier, who was a barker at the Coney Island for a while, but he was in Chaos, the movie, the TV series Chaos. He was Daedalus. He eventually went on to do American Horror Story, Carnival. Yeah, big famous guy. He spent some time there doing grinding, is what they call it, barking. Here's how Otis the Frog Boy was presented at the International World of Wonder sideshows. You can see here, this is a frog-human hybrid who is black, who looks a lot like David showed us last night, these slides of images of African Americans as compared to apes, you know? This looks a lot like that. He's naked, he's in a swamp, you know? This is a very problematic image, obviously, right? Otis the Frog Boy, this is a monster. Otis the Frog Boy's a monster. At Coney Island sideshow by the seashore, he becomes Otis the Human Cigarette Factory. And as you can see, he's presented here exactly the way he looks in his normal clothes, his performing clothes, which is a button-down short-sleeve shirt. He's got some stuff on there that he works with on his tray, on his wheelchair. Here he is in front of his sign. See him roll and light a cigarette using only his lips, right? This is, according to Dick Ziggin, who was the showrunner at Coney Island Sideshow by the Seashore, still is, at the time in 1986, this is having freaks but not exploiting them, is what he said. Okay? This brings me to Jesse Helms. Some of you will remember Jesse Helms. Those of you who do not just need to know that he was a Republican senator from North Carolina known for supporting racist and anti-LGBT legislation. He was a bad guy, a very bad guy. Coney Island relied on federal grants from the National Endowment for the Arts. In the 80s, the NEA was under attack for funding controversial artworks like those of Robert Mapplethorpe, they're like this one, largely because it showed black and white people having sex together, and it was gay. Jesse Helms led a public crusade against the NEA, claiming these works were contrary to the moral majority of Americans. This is a big phrase of his, moral majority. The NEA budget was slashed by 50% at this time. And this caused the elimination of many, many arts programs in the US, including some that I was involved with. Not only did Coney Island survive this cut, which you would think would be an immediate target, but not only did they survive it because they were not exploiting freaks, they just had them, but the freak show went on a European tour sponsored by Philip Morris, the cigarette manufacturing giant. Philip Morris was the single largest donor to the Helms campaign. Apparently they liked Jordan's cigarette angle. So at the end of the story here, do we condemn Coney Island for capitulating to conservatives and big tobacco and exhibiting human misery, or do we congratulate them for their subversive reconditioning of Jordan's body in a way that earned him freedom, regular wages, and health benefits? Do we condemn Jordan for refusing to acknowledge how his performance hurts people with disabilities, or congratulate him for his victory against those who sought to isolate him? What do we make of a tradition that keeps being declared dead and then rising from its own ashes? This time from the ashes of a cigarette. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm standing here now to introduce to you Rosemarie Garland Thomson, who is Professor Emerita of English and Bioethics at Emory University. Why am I standing here? Why am I introducing her? You all already know her. You all already know her work. Extraordinary Bodies, Staring, Eye of the Beholder, and of course, Freakery, and most recently, Freak Inheritance, Eugenics, and Extraordinary Bodies in Performance. But you already know this. You've read them. If you teach, you've assigned them. If you're students, you've been assigned them. And if you teach and you have assigned them, you've had the moments of watching your students' minds crack open and grow a bit and become more capacious and see the world and the people in it in a slightly different way. And that is surely the best thing any of us can hope to accomplish in a session of a course. So, today she gives to us from wonder to error, from the profane to the sacred, monsters, angels, Terata, ethics.
Gosh, thank you for that really generous introduction. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Michael and Analola. It's really an honor and a treat, a delight to be here. So I'm going to talk today about, these things happen. When you actually prepare something, it migrates from what you said you were going to do. But so my presentation today is called Wondrous Monsters. And I want to apologize again for being late. I didn't manage the shuttle schedule very effectively, but here we are. So to begin, here are the two books that I want to focus on a little bit that I think have laid some of the groundwork for what might be called freak studies or monster studies, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. And so I'm showing an image of the, I think, 1997 book called Freakery, and then its child, Freak Inheritance, which came out last year that Analola and Michael and I worked on together. So I want to start with a definition of monsters that'll be the working definition that we might consider when I show you some of the images that I'm trying to think about here. So the qualities of being that make monsters monsters, I want to suggest, is that they are hybrid creatures. That is to say, they are always combinations of more than one thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that hybridity operates. They are also always, in some sense, scale violations. They are things that we would expect to be a particular size and that have been either made larger or smaller through scale, and I'll give you some examples of this. The other aspect that creates monstrosity or monsters is that they are atypical forms, okay? So we'll look at some of these. What they are in total is what I want to call departures from the expected. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm calling profane monsters, and that would be the category of freaks and monsters that we're accustomed to, and that Michael has talked about, many of us have written about, and give you some examples. Here's a very interesting, in my view, profane monster. This is a painting done by a Polish artist whose name I cannot pronounce, but in the image here, I have a caption which tells you the name of the painting and the name of the artist. It's called Of Mice and Men, of course, and it's a reference to John Steinbeck's novel. And we have here this lumbering, monstrous Lenny, who is holding shoes in his hand and what appears to be a tool of some sort. And what's most distinctive about this large character with a kind of lumberjack shirt is the face, and I'm showing a close-up of the face. And what we have here, instead of an actual face, is an illustration of the barracks at Auschwitz-Birkenau. So this is commenting about the convergence of eugenics and the programs in the eugenics that exterminated people with disabilities. That program you may know is called T4. So there's a lot packed into this image of monstrosity, but what you see is the various violations of form and scale that I mentioned that creates this lumbering monster based on Steinbeck's novel. Here's another example of monstrosity. This is a cartoon version or a graphic novel of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and the cover here I think is quite interesting. It's a bug that is, again, a hybrid in some way between a person and a bug. It looks like a beetle with a rather human face that looks both terrified and terrifying at the same time. And we have here an unusual form because this bug or this insect, this vermin, has 6 legs, and so it becomes, again, this humanized form that is a hybrid between a bug and a person. Another example here, of course, are robots that fall into what we call, as I'm sure you're familiar with this concept, of the uncanny valley. So these are some robots that are examples of these creepy or unsettling robots that fall into this uncanny valley. Briefly, the uncanny valley is a psychological state, a psycho-emotional state, actually, that one experiences when you are perceiving something that gets very close to the human, and the closer it gets to the human, the more uncanny it becomes. So that's why, for example, the insect, the vermin that I showed you on the cover of Kafka's novel, is not as uncanny for us as these disturbing robots, because they come so close to being representations of the human, but they're not human. So they, in some sense, are much more unsettling to us than the kinds of illustrations that we see of other monstrous hybrid figures like all of the different versions of the vermin from Kafka. So I want to talk a little bit more about what I call prodigious monsters, and Michael introduced the concept of the prodigy. Prodigious, of course, means that they are literally larger than life. They're out of scale and they're out of shape. And they are, in this sense, extraordinary. That is to say, they are outside of the ordinary. And these are aesthetic monsters that I'll give you some examples of here. And again, I want to suggest that they are extraordinary in the sense that they are outside of the normal, but they are also scale and shape violations. And so I'm going to talk about a few prodigies, wonders, and of course Michael pointed out that these are understood as omens, messages, because they have something to say to us that us who are normal. Here are some examples. Here's a Pegasus slaying a chimera from a Roman mosaic. So this illustrates the idea that these hybrid figures have been part of the human imagination for a very long time. We have here, as I said, a Pegasus, that's a winged horse with a Roman figure slaying a lion here. Many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with the work of the medical man, Ambrose Paré, from the mid-16th century. This is an example of some of the figures that were prodigies, that is to say, omens, that Paré drew. And some of them actually are based on what are called monsters, that is to say, the Terata that are conjoined people. And these are sometimes quite accurate, actually. So these are some illustrations of what we would think of as conjoined twins. This is an engraving. It's a self-portrait from Matthias Buchinger, who was a calligrapher and a marksman in Nuremberg. This is from 1724. And it is an illustration he's done of himself. He's an armless and legless calligrapher. And in his self-portrait here, which is very ornate, and he has inscribed, it's hard to see here, in his hair, the Lord's Prayer and various books of the Bible, the Psalms. So this is, again, this prodigious talent that we have from a armless and legless calligrapher, who of course asks the question, how did he do it? And that's part of the rhetoric, really, of these freak and monster performances. Some more of these unusual shapes, these shape and size violations. We have here Miss Rosina from 1890 on the left. She is a person with very unusual arms and legs, and she's dressed in a Victorian costume here. This is part of this archive of late 19th and early 20th century photography of these unusual people. And there's been a lot of work done on this photography, of course. Michael has done some of it, and many of us have. Robert Bogdan, in particular, has a great collection. And on the right is a photograph of the famous Siamese twins, Eng and Chang Bunker, taken in around 1960. They were conjoined at the chest, and again, they become, like Paré noted, a violation of form, because we have here two bodies that are connected rather than the expected singleton embodiment that most of us have. Another armless wonder and a legless wonder. I love this photograph. It is a photograph of Charles Tripp, who Michael just spoke about, and Eli Bowen. Eli Bowen is legless, Charles Tripp is armless, and they are riding together in collaboration, a tandem bicycle with Bowen on the front and Tripp on the back. And so this was, again, part of this very vibrant iconography, or this archive of photographs in the late 19th and early 20th century. Another prodigy here comes from Velasquez. This is Las Maninas from 1656. This is one of the very common portraits of the court dwarfs. So we have here these miniature people dressed up as entertainers in the European courts. This was very common practice, as you all know. Another part of this archive of what I want to consider to be prodigies, we have D.N. Arbus's famous 1970 photograph on the left, Jewish giant at home with his parents in the Bronx, New York. And this is Eddie Carmel, who was a literal giant, and he's regarding his astonished parents, who are regarding him in this really wonderful choreography, which makes Eddie Carmel a giant in comparison with his parents. Without the house to give Eddie Carmel a context, without the small parents to give him the context to make him into a giant, what we have here is a photograph that creates Eddie Carmel as a giant. And so this contrast was, of course, part of the iconography of freaks and giants and monsters throughout the 19th and the 20th century and even before. On the right, we have Annie Leibowitz's picture of Jennifer Miller, who is a bearded lady who performed, you met her, I think, didn't you? Yeah, at Coney Island. And again, she becomes a bearded lady by the illustration here, which I think is just a wonderful picture, in which you have this gender hybrid that is created through representation with the beard, which is a mark of masculinity, and the breasts, which is a mark of femininity, combined together in this hybrid, gender hybrid portrait by Annie Leibowitz. Of course, we have the really famous double amputee here on the right, that is the Venus de Milo. And on the left, you have a commentary on the Venus de Milo, and that is the 2005 statue by Mark Quinn of Alison Lapper, pregnant. And Alison Lapper, you may know, is a living actual woman who is more or less a quadruple congenital amputee, who was portrayed, as I said, in Trafalgar Square in Mark Quinn's sculpture of her in 2005. And so, again, we have a prodigious presentation here in the sense that we have a violation of what is expected form. Here, I wanted to show you, we've been talking about this, or at least I've been talking about this with several of you who work on Frankenstein. And this is an image from the Frankenstein Ballet, which was performed in London and in San Francisco. And I was fortunate enough to be able to see it and also to be able to write a little bit about it. But what I was interested in with the Frankenstein Ballet is the challenge, the representational challenge of how you convert a narrative, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is all words and no pictures, into another aesthetic form, which is a ballet, which is no words and all images. And so it was very interesting to see how the choreography and the costuming created Frankenstein. How am I doing for time here?
You're at 5 minutes.
Okay. I wanted to quickly go through some prodigious monsters of a different genre, which is what I call the cute, the caricature, and the cartoon. So these are not threatening monsters in the same way that we would imagine, say, Frankenstein, but they're really quite interesting. We have here an image of Charles and Lavinia Stratton at their wedding, photographed by Matthew Brady in 1863. And of course, they are miniature bride and groom. So again, this violation of scale is what makes them both prodigious and unusual. Frankenstein here, an image of Boris Karloff, of course, from 1931 in the famous movie. And then on the right, we have a chibi Frankenstein monster. Chibi is the Japanese aesthetic tradition of, it's a cartooning tradition that is most familiar to us. Oh, I've got this in the wrong order. This is Big Bird and Grover, who again are are hybrid monsters, but they are not threatening monsters. They are understood as adorable monsters. They are understood as cuddly kinds of monsters, but nonetheless, they are hybrid figures, which is achieved by color and costuming and scale. And so they fall into this chibi aesthetic, which is most well known to us through the figure of Hello Kitty. And of course, Minnie and Mickey Mouse, who again are not terrifying hybrids. They are in some ways cute hybrids, and that's what the chibi figure is, which is really quite interesting. There are a few more illustrations here I have of books, the cockroach, the rat, the worm, the spider, where caricature and cartooning is used to make these adorable, cute, non-threatening kinds of monstrous figures that nevertheless fall into the category of monstrosity through their manipulation of scale and size in these illustrations. This is a cockroach that my friend Lawrence Ware designed. This is Rory the Roach, which is I wanted him to be able to, because I was talking about Kafka and the Metamorphosis, and I wanted him to design, or asked him to design, a cute cockroach. And this is what he came up with, which is Rory is on a lounge chair, and he's got big sunglasses, he's reading a book, and he's got 6 legs, and holding a cell phone in one and a book in another. So it's very interesting, I thought. Chibi-like illustration rather than the terrifying ones that we were accustomed to. I'm going to end with some images of what I call sacred monsters. I've been trying to think about, as I mentioned, profane monsters and sacred monsters as 2 distinct categories in terms of the cultural work that they do. And the sacred monster that I wanted to think about is an angel. And I've only started on this, but I want to put forward the idea that angels in the iconography of in Christianity, of course, are monsters that do a different kind of cultural work. And so I'm showing some images here. This is Giotto, the Lamentation of Christ. We have a bunch of angels floating around on the top. So these are mostly scenes where we have angels. They are mostly scenes, obviously, from the Christian story of embodiment, which of course is the story of Jesus. So this is the Lamentation of Christ. So this is at the end of the life of Christ, and again, it's accompanied by angels that are flying around here. But the picture that I am most compelled about and trying to think about now is Botticelli's Annunciation, where we have, this is at the Uffizi, where we have, in Botticelli style, this beautiful encounter here between the angel, I think it's Gabriel, am I right? Yeah. Who is announcing to the Virgin. We have many, many, many annunciations, but I like this one in particular because there is, the angel is in this posture of imploring and warning at the same time, and Mary is in a posture of resistance to the proposition that is being put forward to her. And what I think is most interesting about this is the interchange of the fully human, that is to say, Mary, and the extra human, that is to say, the angel, and his announcement or his request that she will not just have a baby, but that she will have a baby that is understood as the embodiment of God. So there's a lot going on here, and what I think is particularly interesting for our purposes here is the work of the angel, the work of the hybrid bird-man that we have here in that angel. So there are a couple of other interesting images. I'm going to end just with this one that, again, I'm trying to do something with. This is called the Adoration of the Christ Child, and it's a nativity again. And it's very unusual. It's in the Met in New York. It's from 1550, and it's not clear who has done this. But there are several articles that point out that some of the angels, as well as the two witnesses that are next to the Virgin here, have the features of people with Down syndrome. And so people who work in bioethics are using this as evidence, of course, that the congenital condition that we think of as Down syndrome has a long history, and that it might be interpreted somewhat differently in the 16th century here than we maybe understand these forms of embodiment here and now. So this is a close-up of it, and you can perhaps perceive the faces of the images here that seem to bear a resemblance to people with Down syndrome. Thank you.
She specializes in Latin American and Latinx theater and performance, and has published 2 authored books on the subject: Freak Performance, Dissidents in Latin American Theater, 2018, and that's the most recent of them. She's co-edited a whole lot of things, including 2018's, a lot of things came out in 2018. Yeah, you must be exhausted. Theater and Cartographies of Power, Repositioning the Latina/Latino Americas. My last book, Cartographies of Exclusion, Our Books Should Hang Out. With Michael Chemers, she also edited Monsters in Performance, and The Figure of the Monster in Global Theater, and most recently, she's got 2 more out in 2024. I can't list them all, they keep going. But today she will present to us Latin American Freaks and Colonizing Discourse.
Thank you, Michael, thank you. This is so exciting because I never get to see these 2 in person, so I'm so happy. Oh, thank you, it's for reading you. All right, so I am going to attempt to talk to you about really these tools that they're posing and applying them to theatrical practices in Latin America. So I'm going to show you some examples, but we're not going very deep into it because we have like 15 to 20 minutes. So. Okay, so I first encountered the work of Rosemarie Garland Thomson and her groundbreaking anthology, Freakery, Cultural Spectacles of the Extraordinary Body, by chance as a grad student. Her field-defining introduction gave me the language I had been searching for to discuss the images and ideas I had been noticing in my own work on Latin American theater and performance. Later, I was very lucky to find Michael Chemers, I can't do the possessive, Staging Stigma, a critical examination of the American Freak Show, and that deepened my understanding of agency, as he showed you in this beautiful presentation, within the history of exhibiting extraordinary bodies. Together, these works transformed my own conception of otherness by framing disability not as a disease, but as a minoritarian identity with its own cultural and aesthetic significance. They opened an intersection among disability performance, literature, and bioethics, a framework that has profoundly shaped my own research. In my own work on Latin American cultural production, I look at how theater uses allegories of this figure we're calling the freak to denounce the racist hegemonic constructions of Latin American identity that began with what they love to call the Age of Discovery, right? Which really we're talking about a period that needs to be understood as the beginning of a colonization project that continues into the present. On Latin American stages, the figure of the freak becomes a political and ethical symbol, a site where difference is performed, interrogated, and reclaimed. Here is the value of applying the framework of disability studies into cultural studies, and in this case, performance studies, to see how the body on stage can be transformed to reflect deeper social and political acts of resistance. For me, and this is my own personal take on my work, theater making is both artistic and ethical. It's a way to confront, through creativity, the sociopolitical realities that shape our understanding of difference. So what I want to do is show you some examples of how theater makers in Latin America are accomplishing this. Let's start with a premise. I find it very interesting that the term freak itself does not have a direct translation into Spanish. Common equivalents are anormal, fenómeno, criatura, raro, but these are missing layered meanings. So in Latin America, people often use the English term, lo friki, to describe what resists categorization. Yet the history of the term is deeply entwined with the construction of Latin American identity as a site of exotic otherness, a tradition that we need to think about as extending and stretching back to Columbus's display of indigenous people in the Spanish court to the 19th century freak shows like Julia Pastrana is one prime example, and more recently to immigration raids and border spectacles. So the use of freak in Latin American culture represents more than linguistic borrowing. It marks a semantic shift, an act of resistance against exclusion itself. My own interest in freakery began with how the monstrous races of antiquity were transposed into descriptions of the Americas. They were particularly the wild man. The wild man was the figure that was mostly, and if you want to read more about this, Roger Bartra is a wonderful anthropologist from Mexico who writes a lot about this. So these were, the indigenous people of this so-called New World were captured and displayed as living specimens, meaning bodies that were both wondrous and subhuman. Understanding this racialization of the monstrous body is crucial for analyzing how Latin American subjectivities were constructed and how theatrical display always accompanied the exercise, and continues, of colonial power. We can even trace this logic in the early world maps. The maps often included women to represent particular values imposed by a European colonial mindset upon the discovered lands. These maps often included additional illustrations that served as worldviews and allegories for the different continents. The visual tropes always depicted the Americas as the land of cannibals, of savages, and aimed to naturalize colonization and legitimize the violent practices that decimated native populations. Let's look at an example. You have Abraham Ortelius's 1570 Theatrus Orbim Terrarum, which is the world's first atlas. On the title page, you have Europe enthroned on a stage, enthroned as an empress above the world, flanked by this very centralized Asia and Africa, while at the bottom, there she is, at the bottom you have America, holding a severed European head next to the bust of Majelica to represent South America. So this allegory naturalized colonization, presenting the Americas as barbaric and savage, while Europe appeared as civilization's rightful ruler. These images established a visual grammar of coloniality, a way of seeing that rendered the Americas present as objects, but always absent as subjects. So the Argentinian semiotician Walter Mignolo calls this perspective the perspective of coloniality. He talks about it as a worldview through which Europe made itself the center of reason and humanity and relegated the colonial subjects to oversimplified categories, right? Like Indian, black. That also embodied negative values and classifications. You were primitive, savage, monstrous. As Mignolo writes, coloniality produces what he terms a colonial wound, both physical and psychological, a trauma born of racism and the denial of humanity to those outside Europe's locus of enunciation. In that sense, the construction of Latin American identity as freak is an embodiment of this colonial wound. It's how difference was, and still is, made to appear threatening, excessive, or in need to be controlled. This visual and ideological framework emerges powerful in, for example, if we're talking about theater, Hecho en Perú. This is a performance piece by Grupo Cultural Yuyashkani, a Peruvian company that started in the 70s, continues to this day. This is a piece from 2001. So this is a performance installation that transforms the freak show into a mirror for national identity. So what they did is they took over this sort of like shopping center, and they created a series of vitrinas, which were glass display cases, and each one exhibited a Peruvian social type as living specimens. So you had the soldier, you had the domestic worker, you had the politician, you had the beggar. And audiences circulated between the vitrinas. It was a fascinating piece because the audience then becomes complicit in the act of looking, forced to confront how spectacle itself reproduces colonial hierarchies of visibility. So Hecho en Perú exposes how the state, the media, and even art participate in displaying and disciplining the bodies of the poor and the racialized. The freak show's gaze, rather than a relic of the past, becomes a mode of governance, one that continues to define who counts as fully human within this national order. The freak show, may seem like a relic of the past, but the logic behind it, the classification and display of so-called abnormal bodies, continued well into the 20th century. And here's where I now turn to what we worked on, through the eugenic projects. These were national experiments that spread throughout the Americas and are particularly imposing and threatening in the Latin American context. Throughout the region, elites, often under the auspices of US interventionism, sought to improve national populations by encouraging whiteness and suppressing indigenous and African heritage. The same logic that justified exhibiting the extraordinary body justified policing the racialized body. Eugenics gave scientific legitimacy to colonial hierarchies. It turned social discrimination into state ideology. Under its influence, normalcy became a civic duty. To be non-white, non-conforming, or disabled was to be unfit for their modern nation, according to this new Latin American social order, right? The language of the freak show and the language of the eugenicist were two sides of the same project, each defining humanity through exclusion. The legacy of these ideologies still shapes contemporary Latin American identity, where ideals of beauty, ability, and citizenship remain tied to colonial notions of normalization. This tension between, fascination and exclusion, I want to give you another example, finds a theatrical echo in this beautiful play called De Monstruos y Prodigios, just like Ambroise Parés' title, because it's very much one of the characters of the conjoined twins are Ambroise and, I'm blanking out on the second one's name, Paré. Those are the conjoined twins. This is a play from 2001 by Teatro de Ciertos Habitantes from Mexico City, which is also a company that was founded in 97. So framed as a dramatized lecture by these conjoined twins, who are one a surgeon, one an opera critic, the play tells the story of the Italian castrato, who you have in the middle. It's not a great picture, the middle one, who actually is an actor who is a natural castrato because he suffered from cancer in his young age, and radiation kept his voice as a natural castrato. So the play tells the story of the castrato, an artist that is both celebrated and abjected by European culture. As the performance oscillates between wonder and horror, beauty and deformity, it allegorizes Latin America's position within the global imaginary. Desired for its exoticism, Bad Bunny showing us this, right? So, desired for its exoticism, yet dismissed as monstrous. In the Monstruos y Prodigios, the freakish body becomes an allegory for colonial modernity itself, a body disciplined by science and aesthetics, yet never fully assimilable to the norms if it is forced to perform. So taking the concept of freakery beyond that US European context, which is what we're most used to, then means confronting how colonial modernity itself produces freakishness in a way to make colonized bodies visible, knowable, and above all, controllable. In Latin America, freakery became a mode of representing the colonized subject as both wondrous and abject, simultaneously desired and disavowed. The freak was never just a performer. It was a political category, a sign of ungovernable and the incomplete human. Yet contemporary artists have turned that history on its head. I'm going to show you another example. This one's from Chile, Gemelos by Teatro Cinema, which is also a company that really started at the end of the dictatorship. This is a piece from 1999. In Gemelos, meaning twins, the freak is not only externalized as spectacle, but it's internalized as trauma. This is a beautiful play based on Agota Christoph's novel and follows these twin boys that you see on the side surviving amid the violence of war. They're sent to live with their grandmother, who's this witch-like figure that you see in the middle. The way in which they act, the performance itself, is their mirrored bodies, right? They always are acting sort of like reflecting each body, and it's very much interchangeable identities, evoking that freakish double. But here the monstrosity arises from a brutal social order that requires cruelty for survival. So Gemelos locates freak identity not in bodily anomaly, but in the moral deformities engendered by dictatorship and conflict in this case. The twins' resilience, both a form of adaptation and of disobedience, embodies what might be called a politics of endurance, turning monstrosity into an ethics of survival. These performances transform freakery into a language of agency, beauty, and resilience. In this sense, the freak becomes an allegory for colonized subjectivity itself. Both the freak and the colonized others are defined by external gazes, but both also have the power to unsettle those gazes. The freak's visibility, the capacity to confront the spectator, destabilizes the very frameworks that produce normalcy. Performing freakery, therefore, becomes, what I'm talking about with these plays, becomes an act of resistance, a refusal to disappear within systems that depend on erasure. The terms freak and monster function as rhetorical figures for Latin American otherness. Both exist in what Julia Kristeva has shown us, the realm of abjection, right? Within the colonial matrix of power, Latin America was cast into this very zone, the margins of reason, civilization, and even humanity. To call the colonized subject monstrous was to deny its personhood while still using it to define the boundaries of the human. Historically, Western fascination with monstrosity provided the language through which colonial difference was articulated. From Aristotle's writing on biological anomaly to those medieval catalogs of monstrous races, these were very much transposed onto the people of the Americas, who were then exhibited as living specimens of hybridity and defect. Go read Columbus's journals, right? We were the dog-faced people. The freakification, if we call it that, of the colonial subject transformed the violence of conquest into spectacle, justifying domination in the name of science and civilization. I give you, for example, artists like Regina José Galindo, who's a beautiful performance artist from Guatemala. Regina José Galindo takes this legacy to a corporeal extreme. This is her piece titled Piedra, meaning stone, from 2013. Here you see Galindo crouching naked and motionless like a block of stone. She's covered in carbon, which is carbon. That's what okay, carbon. And she stays motionless like a block for about, it's almost 40 minutes. And in that interim, 3 men urinate upon her. You see that piece on that side. So she's embodying the dehumanization of women's bodies under systemic violence. Her stillness, refusing the spectacle of pain while inviting the voyeuristic gaze, reconfigures the freak's visibility into an act of protest. The performance collapses the distance between the abject and the sacred, transforming the female body, so often pathologized or fetishized, into a monument of endurance. She does not move for 40 minutes. Piedra reveals how the freak's body, once displayed for others' consumption, can become a site of self-determination and collective mourning. When Latin American artists today reclaim the figure of the freak, they expose these long histories of visual violence. Their work reveals how colonial categories, monstrous, abnormal, exotic, still shape modern forms of racialization and ableism. But through performance, these categories are inverted. The spectacle becomes critique. The gaze of power is turned back upon itself. The freak's very endurance, their ability to survive by transforming the normative, embodies a politics of perseverance that resonates deeply with Latin Americans' own history of colonial survival. Here, quoting, for example, Diane Arbus, who once wrote, "Freaks have already been through it," right? So on Latin American stages, this sentiment takes on political force. The freak bears witness, staging the abject as beautiful and the monstrous as human. In doing so, it reclaims the right to appear, to be seen and heard on their own terms. In contemporary moment, the logic of the freak show has not vanished, it has simply evolved. We see it in the surveillance of migrants and racialized bodies, in the spectacle of the border, and the biopolitical management of undesirable populations. Today's freak is the detained, the deported, the undocumented, the body rendered excessive, too visible, too foreign. The theater of immigration, control, and media spectacle continues the old colonial performance of difference. Yet artists across the Americas are confronting this gaze, from Hecho en Perú's vitrinas to Galindo's silenced body in piedra, to the conjoined twins in the Monstruos y Prodigios, to the traumatized doubles of Gemelos. Latin American artists transformed the spectacle of freakery into a critique of colonial gaze itself. Their work insists that to perform the freak is to make visible the violence that defines normalcy, and to imagine through performance what a decolonial human might be. So I'll leave it there because I think I'm over.
Okay, so thank you very much to our three speakers for three fascinating talks. I open the floor for your questions.
Hi, thanks for the amazing talks. I just was wondering, you had all this wonderful work about people who are subverting the sort of stare, as Rosemarie talks about it. And I've done a lot. I think this is for all of you, but maybe starting with Rosemarie. I've been sort of thinking about your work through the film Sisters, of just the sort of ways that, you know, the male gaze kind of structures cinema in general, and the sort of flip side of the kind of male objectifying gaze and the stare to the freak, because in Sisters, the protagonist is kind of both a beautiful woman and a former conjoined twin, so she's sort of occupying both those positions. And I'm just kind of wondering, I feel like everybody had such great language for the ways that performers are subverting the sort of position of to be looked at as a freak in sort of new iterations of sort of representing disability. But is there a sort of language for the way that we look at things like the Arbus or the Leibowitz or the Piedra or the Cigarette Man, we're kind of, the performers are doing such an amazing job of showing themselves as empathetic and sort of communal figures, and how do we articulate the way that we're looking at those images?
Well, thank you for that interesting question. I don't know, are you talking about a film called Sisters? I'm sorry. Oh, can you tell us a little bit more about it briefly?
Oh, sure. It's just a film, it's a horror film, and Margot Kidder in it at the beginning is a sort of actress model who's this very beautiful sort of Hitchcockian woman, and it's a very Hitchcockian kind of film where the the gaze is played, De Palma plays with the way that she's objectified, but also kind of subverts it by always showing the people looking at her and showing the male gaze itself as kind of an object in the film. And then as the film sort of progresses, we realize that she was formerly a conjoined twin and she was forcibly separated, and her twin was killed. It was a sacrifice separation, as is discussed in some of the work on disability studies. And so that's her trauma, is her original. She was like made normal by this separation forcibly by a doctor lover who wants her to be his wife. So it's really
that's
it's
fabulous.
really amazing. Yeah.
I mean, thank you for telling us about this. The only thing that I could offer is that I wrote a book a while back called Staring, in which I was trying to think through visual relations in a somewhat different way from what we think of as gaze theory. So I wanted to differentiate the stare from the gaze. And so I don't know, I had some examples of performers who engage the stare, but also what I wanted to do was to bring forward the agency of people who are what I called starees, and think about that in the context of disability rather than in the context only of gender, which of course is what gaze theory tends to do. So I wanted to differentiate between the gaze and the stare, so that might be helpful. Yeah, thank you. That sounds wonderful. I can't wait to read what you are going to write about. So keep in touch.
Have a draft.
Yeah.
I just, is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'm just thinking of freaking the contemporary usage, like, you know, she's a freak or they're a freak, and there's a certain linguistic reclamation with that term, meaning, you know, someone enthusiastic or, you know, uninhibited about sex. I just was wondering if, you know, if you like have, if you comment on that, like the sort of positive sense of freakery in, even though it's a kind of more contemporary, you know, usage, but what you make of that reclamation?
Yeah, I can address this really briefly. I talk about this in my book, actually. Le Freak C'est Chic was what was the name of the band? Chic? I think the name of the band was Chic. Yeah, 1979 that came out, right? And that was a notable moment in the turning point of this, as you say, the reclamation of this word, right? Which is actually an Old English word, which is probably why it's not in Spanish. Frickion was the name of was the actual word, and it meant to move in an unexpected way. So it was really referring to dances, to like these very spasmodic kind of jerky dances that they would do, which were called frikis, right? So, but yeah, I think that, you know, like any pejorative term or term that has pejorative weight attached to it, it can be reclaimed, like queer, for instance, has been, right, and turned into a battle cry, and that's a pretty cool thing. However, I think in this case, the word freak did not, the liberation of the word freak did not necessarily translate to the liberation of people who have extraordinary bodies, right? And instead it became more about like, oh, well, you're a computer freak or a sex freak or a, you know, a freak of, I don't know. It just meant you're really into something, right? So it still retains the notion of being unexpectedly intense, but not, I think, in a way that was liberatory for people with disabilities. Yeah.
And to add to that, one of the definitions of freak from, I don't know, that you'd find in the OED is that it meant whimsy. So people would go out for a freak, meaning to have a whimsical experience. So that was not a negative connotation at all. But we've lost that.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing is the way that the word freak becomes associated with people with disabilities has to do with this. There's a Latin term that during the classification craze that biologists use called lusus naturae, freaks of nature, sports of nature, right? Sudden, unexpected movements of nature. And so that's where how that freakery becomes attached to people with disabilities through the tradition of the Cabinet of Curiosities, right? That predates the museum. It's really interesting stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I think this is working. Thank you all for a really, really wonderful panel. I think this might be addressed to everyone, but I hope this question is kind of well conceived, because I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. But I was really interested in the painting that Rosemarie that you showed of the angels who appeared to recall individuals with Down syndrome, and this idea of a history of disability, because we have a tendency to view certain disabilities as perhaps a crisis, or certain kinds of, extraordinary bodies as kind of a crisis of the contemporary or something more recent. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on sort of how disability or extraordinary bodies are kind of understood in terms of temporality, that they're either often viewed as sort of a throwback to something ancient or as a particularly modern crisis. And I'm thinking in this case of how certain kind of political figures in the US at the moment are framing like neurodivergence as a contemporary phenomenon, as opposed to something that actually has a much longer history.
Well, in some sense, that's what we've all been talking about in the history of narrating human variation, right? Has a break, if you will, in modernity with the shift from narratives of divine narratives to medical narratives. So I think that's a good historical explanation to talk about in relation to how human differences become medicalized in modernity, and that they were understood, of course, as testimonies to God's infinite capacity to create variety and whimsy, and before that, the prodigies. So these are explanatory narratives for not just human variation, but for human distinctiveness, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a great panel. I just kind of had a general question that might be for anybody on the panel. I'm teaching Geek Love by Catherine Dunn this semester. Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot of representation in terms of like performance and art and photography of the exceptional or extraordinary body, but not as much in literature. And if it is in literature, it's usually like a fictionalized account of Julia Pastrana or something. Do you have any thoughts about the Geek Love, if you've read it, in terms of a completely, I guess, original Banusky family portrayed in that as a kind of a traveling freak show, in terms of, I guess, just literature without the visuals?
Well, Rosemarie wrote quite a bit about the representation of extraordinary bodies in literature in her 1997 book, Extraordinary Bodies.
Extraordinary
so I
Bodies.
highly
Okay.
recommend that.
I've read Freakery.
Yeah, highly recommend. That was a productive couple of years for you, for sure. Yeah. So it's there, but I think you're right. It's problematic because certainly literature that is about freaks tends to be highly fictionalized, as you say, right? Which is not that useful to the historical mindset, except to give us a sense of how disability is being acculturated at that moment, right? And literature or documentation of actual freaks tends to be lies. In fact, it's always lies, right? frog boy, there's no lobster boy, there's no human spider woman. It's those things don't exist. So the presentation of the freak exaggerates those differences in a way that makes us uncomfortable, right? And it's designed to make us uncomfortable because they would make more money that way. The more uncomfortable we were, the more we would pay to see them, right? Yeah. So the joke's on us, really. But yeah, anything else to add?
Well, Geek Love's a really interesting book, and I
do remember, it's coming
and
back
there's
to me
some
now,
literature on it. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff written about it.
so much, yes.
Yeah. But I think it's hard for students to think about the characterizations in Geek Love, because we have sentimental figures and we have the heroes and the villains, and it does really upset our stereotypical narratives about people with disabilities.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because so many of the photographers too would not maybe be in that category, and neither would Catherine Dunn. But they're taking this on as their subject matter. And I remember reading one of your pieces about doing that with giantesses and in different fictions, and I'm trying to remember the stories and I can't. But it is problematic, but it's worth tackling maybe.
Well, everything's problematic.
Right?
Everything is indeed problematic.
I mean, one thing I would want to say about the work that we do in, disability studies, freak studies, monster studies, whatever we want to call it, is that what we're focusing on is the cultural work of representation. Or I've been working in bioethics more, and I want to talk about it as the moral work of representation. So to focus on not so much whether it's good or bad or true or false, but like what it does. And I am always reaching to Eve Sedgwick, who offered the concept of reparative readings, as opposed to the more skeptical readings, or what she calls paranoid readings. I don't think that word works very well, but reparative reading, I think, is a really good term for us to use, in particular in freak and monster studies or disability studies. Right. Like what you're saying, what you brought up about Otis is really one of the moral dilemmas that we have. And so I think it's important to think about, as I said, our readings of bodies in general, and to think about those in terms of it kind of go further than the easy critique that's out there.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. I just wanted to get your perspective on something that I was thinking about during this whole thing, is thinking about what was talked about in the book by Andrew and Carl Sagan, The Demon Hunter World, about how we explain things we don't understand in the context of the time that we're in. So starting off with explaining these differences as manifestations of demonic entities, and then moving to explaining things as demonic possession as opposed to physical manifestations of entities, and then later on to explaining them as the way I think of it as deviants of science. For instance, in our modern era of basically making the, as you'd say, people with autism, and also including people with gender dysmorphia, et cetera, as deviants of science, or manifesting their difference as deviants of science, and making that a disability in our society. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that thought that I had.
Well, you're describing what we all do. Thank you.
I did want to respond to what somebody asked earlier about the historicity of things like neurodivergence, right? Who's that? Was that Miranda? Okay, yeah. Thanks, Miranda. So I think it's really interesting how the narratives of disability are being utilized right now, cynically, I would think, by, I think this is what you're getting at, right? By people like, I don't know, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who are trying to say that autism and vaccines are co-emergent, right? Which is nuts. That's nuts. And that, that certain types of disabilities or certain types of unusualnesses are co-emergent with this thing I don't like, right? It's ridiculous. You know, we have evidence of disabilities of all sorts that goes back literally to the earliest surviving documents of human, writing. So this is a problem for us because it scares us, right? We're scared. I mean, I get that Robert F. Kennedy is scared of autism. I get that, right? You know, although I know a lot of people on the spectrum who would have counter arguments, right? As to the value of their lives, you know? Usually this is not good for people with disabilities, right? Although sometimes it is. Sometimes it's like people like St. John Colibus, or the guy who invented the Gregorian chant was also, I think, a little person. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but yeah, totally, exactly.
Well, totally, exactly. We're out of time. Can we please thank our three speakers?